A single dad was laughed at in a ballroom until one bold moment changed everything. Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Michael Carter never thought his name would appear on anything fancier than a car repair invoice. Yet, here it was, printed in elegant black script on cream-colored paper, an invitation to the Bennett Foundation's annual charity gala. He held it in hands that still smelled faintly of motor oil, staring at the embossed crest as though it might vanish if he blinked too hard. For a long moment, he wondered if there had been some mistake. But the name was right there, his name, not as an afterthought, not tucked in small print, but written clearly, as though he truly belonged. Michael was a single father, a mechanic in Portland whose days revolved around socket wrenches and grease-stained overalls. Nights were spent leaning over a kitchen table that wobbled on one leg, helping his daughter Emma solve fractions with washers and bolts pulled from his toolbox. His world was small, practical, and honest. It was not marble staircases or chandeliers. It was not champagne flutes and black ties. And yet this invitation had come because Emma, his bright-eyed 11-year-old, had earned one of the coveted Bennett scholarships at her private school. She had won her place with hard work and brilliance, and the gala was meant to honor families like theirs. At first, Michael thought of tossing the letter into the drawer where he kept old bills and unanswered coupons. He couldn't imagine himself stepping into a ballroom filled with millionaires. The thought of it made his shoulders tighten, as though the very suit he would have to borrow would strangle the air out of him. He had no tuxedo, no polished shoes. He had no easy conversation about stocks or vacations in Paris. The idea of walking into that room felt like setting himself up for humiliation. But Emma had looked at him with that knowing gaze of hers, older than her years, as if she could already hear the excuses forming in his throat. She pushed the envelope back toward him and whispered, "Dad, you deserve to be there. They should see who I'm working so hard for." Her voice carried no doubt, only faith, and it struck him in a place deeper than pride. That night, after she had gone to bed, Michael sat at the kitchen table with the invitation spread before him. He thought about the sacrifices, the years of patching holes in her school uniforms, the mornings spent driving her across town before the shop opened. He thought about how Emma's eyes had shone when she spoke of becoming an astrophysicist, of reaching for the stars, and he realized he couldn't let his own fear dim that light. So he decided he would go, not to impress anyone, not to pretend he was something he wasn't, but to stand in that room for Emma, to show her that her father belonged anywhere her dreams could take her. Even if the suit hung loose on his shoulders, even if his shoes never gleamed like theirs, he would go because she believed in him, and sometimes that was more than enough. The night of the gala arrived with the kind of nervous energy that clung to Michael's chest like a weight he couldn't quite shake. He stood in front of the mirror, tugging at the shoulders of a navy blue suit borrowed from a friend who had worn it a decade earlier. It sagged in places and pulled in others, but it was pressed clean, and for Michael, that would have to be enough. He had polished his shoes until they shone as best they could, though the leather still bore the lines of years gone by. Every detail reminded him of the gap between his world and the one he was about to step into. Yet he kept going because Emma's words still echoed in his mind. They should see who I'm working so hard for. He dabbed a touch of kohl. Ogne, a neighbor had insisted he borrow, then straightened his tie, which felt foreign against his throat. His hands, calloused and scarred from years under the hood of cars, fumbled slightly with the knot. But eventually he managed something passable. When he looked at his reflection, he didn't see a polished gentleman or a man meant for chandeliers. He saw Emma's father, and that was enough to square his shoulders before walking out the door. The drive to the Riverlight Hotel was quiet, the hum of his old pickup truck filling the night air as the city lights blurred past. He parked 2 blocks away, not wanting the rust on his fenders to be the first thing anyone noticed. For a moment, he sat in the driver's seat, breathing deeply, gripping the steering wheel as though letting go meant stepping into a world where he didn't belong. Then he thought of Emma, waiting at home, her hair still damp from her evening shower, her face pressed against the window as she whispered to herself that her dad was brave enough for this. That was enough to push open the door and walk into the cool Portland night. The Riverlight Hotel loomed ahead, glowing like a palace. Its marble steps glistened under golden lights, and luxury sedans lined the curb as valets in crisp uniforms hurried to open doors. Women in gowns that shimmered like jewels glided up the staircase, men in tuxedos beside them, as though they'd rehearsed the ritual their entire lives. Michael stood for a moment on the sidewalk, feeling the unfamiliar sting of comparison. His suit was too big, his shoes too worn, his steps too heavy. And yet, he reminded himself he wasn't here to fit in. He was here because of Emma. He climbed the steps slowly, every footfall echoing louder in his own ears than it did on the marble. The doorman gave him a polite nod, though his eyes lingered a moment too long, as if assessing whether he belonged. Michael returned the nod with steady calm, refusing to shrink. Inside, the air was thick with perfume and the sharp scent of polished wood, the sound of laughter rising like a practiced symphony. Crystal chandeliers hung above, scattering light across the ballroom entrance, where waiters in white gloves moved with the ease of dancers. Michael paused at the threshold, drawing in a long breath. He was out of place here. Anyone could see it. But beneath the weight of that truth, there was another, stronger one. His daughter had earned her seat at this table, and by extension, so had he. No whispered judgment or sidelong glance would take that away. With his head lifted and his jaw set, he stepped forward into the glow of the ballroom. Every instinct told him he didn't belong, but every beat of his heart reminded him why he was here. Not for himself, not for the glittering stage or the champagne towers. He was here because of love, because Emma believed in him, and for her, he would walk into any room, no matter how foreign, no matter how bright. The moment Michael crossed the threshold into the ballroom, he felt the shift. Everything glimmered. Polished floors, catching the light of cascading chandeliers, silver trays of champagne gliding effortlessly between clusters of guests, conversations rising and falling like waves on a shore he'd never walked before. To most, it was familiar, a dance they had rehearsed countless times. To Michael, it felt like stepping into another world. He tried to steady his breathing, to carry himself with quiet dignity. He offered a polite smile to the first couple he passed, a gentle nod of greeting. Their eyes slid over him like glass, pausing just long enough to confirm he was not someone worth remembering before turning back to their laughter. A group of men near the bar gave him a glance, followed by chuckles hidden behind their hands. He didn't need to hear the words to know the tone. To them, he was no guest. He was someone's driver, maybe a last-minute caterer who had wandered too far into the wrong room. Their stares pressed against him, testing whether he would falter, whether he would shrink beneath the weight of assumptions. But Michael did not shrink. He had stood in tougher rooms, school offices where bills outpaced paychecks, shops where customers doubted his skill because of his worn boots and oil-stained hands. He had learned long ago that dignity was not granted by others. It was carried from within. At the table marked with his name, he paused to take in the faces already seated. Sequined gowns shimmered in the light. Watches gleamed with diamonds. And yet not a single smile greeted him. He extended his hand politely, his voice steady though quiet. Michael Carter, my daughter Emma, is one of the Bennett Scholarship students. A woman in a silver dress turned her head halfway, lips curling into a smile that never reached her eyes. "How nice," she murmured before returning her attention to the man beside her. Another guest glanced up from his phone long enough to offer a clipped nod, then slipped back into the glow of his screen. Their body language spoke volumes. They did not see him as part of their circle. Michael eased into his seat, resting his hands on the linen-covered table. For a brief moment, a wave of isolation swept through him, cold and uninviting. But then he pictured Emma, her bright eyes full of pride as she had watched him leave the house. He heard her voice again, soft but firm. "You deserve to be there, Dad." That thought steadied him like a hand on his shoulder. Around him, the room buzzed with talk of markets, vacations, and names spoken as though they carried currency. Michael listened, but he did not pretend to belong to those conversations. Instead, he carried himself with the same grace he had brought into every mechanic's bay, every parent-teacher meeting, every sleepless night when Emma needed comfort. Quiet, steady, unshaken. Yes, the stares lingered. Yes, the whispers curled like smoke at the edges of the room, but Michael sat tall, his presence deliberate. He was not there to prove himself to strangers who measured worth in cufflinks and pedigrees. He was there because Emma had earned her place, and if he had to sit alone in the middle of a crowded room, He would do it with dignity for her and for himself. Michael sat among the glitter and chatter as though he were a shadow no one wished to notice. Yet he did not let the silence bruise him. When spoken to, he answered simply, never stretching the truth, never trying to outshine the room with stories that did not belong to him. His words were measured, grounded, and honest, and for some, it seemed disarming. In a place where voices rose to prove importance, his calmness felt strangely out of rhythm, like a quiet chord played in the middle of a loud symphony. He let others talk of investments in art collections, their sentences polished and rehearsed. He did not interrupt, nor did he pretend to understand a world that was never his. When a man asked if he was in the automotive business, Michael smiled faintly and replied, "I fix cars in a neighborhood garage. Been doing it most of my life." The man's eyebrows flickered upward, then shifted his attention elsewhere. But Michael felt no shame. There was nothing lesser about honest work. His hands, scarred and strong, told a story of years spent building a life for Emma. And that was a story worth carrying, whether the people at that table chose to see it or not. In the middle of it all, he thought of his father, a man who had worked long hours in lumber mills, who came home with sawdust in his hair and fatigue in his eyes, yet never let hardship touch the dignity he carried. Dignity isn't something you wear, his father used to say. It's something you hold inside. No one can strip it from you unless you hand it over yourself. Michael held to that memory like armor tonight. It was all he needed. He sipped only water, declining the wine offered with a gentle shake of his head, not because he feared it, but because he wanted his mind clear. Clear to remember that every breath he took in that grand ballroom was not for himself, but for Emma. She had worked so hard, risen so high, and this evening was part of her story. By being here, by staying present, he was honoring her. His presence was his gift to her, a quiet statement that said, "I see you. I am with you always." The laughter around him sometimes landed sharp, as though aimed in his direction, but he chose not to let it pierce. He reminded himself that he had endured harder battles, nights spent wondering how to stretch a paycheck, mornings patching uniforms so Emma would not feel out of place among her classmates. Compared to that, a ballroom full of whispered judgment was nothing. So he sat steady, shoulders relaxed but unyielding, like a man who knew the weight of his worth, even if no one else in the room recognized it. He did not crave applause. He did not need validation. He only needed to carry himself with the same integrity he had carried into every hard day of his life. And in that quiet strength, there was a power no chandelier could outshine. Michael Carter might have been overlooked by most in that glittering hall, but he understood something vital. True presence was not about being the loudest or the richest. It was about standing firm, unseen if necessary, but never small. For Emma, and for the promise of her future, he would sit in that chair with his dignity intact, as though it were a shield no one could take away. The evening pressed on, a current of polished laughter and calculated charm sweeping through the ballroom. But Michael stayed anchored in his quiet place, steady and still. He had learned long ago that sometimes the strongest thing a man could do was simply remain. Then, without warning, the rhythm of the room shifted. It began as a subtle hush, the kind of pause that ripples through a crowd when someone greater than the spectacle itself, enters. Isabella Bennett had arrived. She didn't storm the ballroom, didn't command attention with loud gestures or forced grandeur. Instead, she moved with the effortless gravity of someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. Draped in a deep emerald gown that shimmered like polished glass, she walked with elegance that was quiet yet unignorable. Conversation softened as she passed, shoulders straightened, voices lowered, people leaned in, eager for a moment of her attention, as though the slightest smile from her could validate an entire evening. Michael noticed her the way everyone did, gradually, then all at once. He had heard the name Bennett whispered for years, always paired with words like fortune, empire, brilliance. She was the architect of the very foundation that had lifted Emma into a better future. Though from a distance, she had always seemed like a figure carved from marble, untouchable, unreachable. Yet here she was, flesh and breath, moving through the crowd like a conductor guiding a silent orchestra. He expected her to glide past, to give her warmth to those who lived in her orbit, those with titles and wealth, and she did. Polite exchanges, gracious nods, a laughter that soothed rather than dazzled. But then her gaze swept across the room, steady and unhurried, until it landed on him. Michael felt it before he understood it. Her eyes lingered, just a heartbeat longer than courtesy required, just enough to mark the moment as deliberate. She didn't skim over him like the others had, didn't dismiss him with a polite glance. She held his gaze, and in that fraction of time, the ballroom shifted. She didn't smile for show, nor did she offer a grand gesture. Instead, Isabella gave him the smallest of nods, subtle, genuine, acknowledging. It was not charity, not curiosity, it was recognition. Michael returned the nod with the quiet respect of a man unaccustomed to being seen in rooms like this. For a second, the noise around them blurred. The chandeliers still sparkled. The violins still played. But none of it mattered, because in a room full of people who measured him by his suit and his silence, someone had finally looked past the surface. At his table, the shift did not go unnoticed. A woman tilted her head, confusion flickering across her painted smile. A man's posture stiffened, his expression faltering for just a moment, as though the rules of the evening had been rewritten without warning. After all, Isabella Bennet wasn't known for gestures without purpose. Her time, her attention, her very presence were currencies of their own, and she had just spent some on him. Michael lowered his gaze back to the water glass in front of him, calm and composed. But something within him stirred. It wasn't pride or triumph. It was something simpler, something rarer. The reminder that even in a place designed to make him feel small, dignity could be seen. And for the first time all night, he no longer felt invisible. The air inside the ballroom had grown heavy, thick with perfume and the hum of voices competing for space. Michael excused himself quietly, slipping toward the tall windows framed by velvet curtains. The glass doors to the balcony stood ajar, letting in a cool breath of Portland night. He stepped outside, grateful for the stillness, the sound of traffic far below, the city lights stretching wide and unbothered like stars scattered across the earth. He leaned against the railing, glass of water in hand, letting the night cool his skin. For the first time since arriving, his shoulders eased. Out here, there were no chandeliers demanding posture, no whispers measuring his worth, just air, open and honest, the kind he could breathe without hesitation. He didn't hear her footsteps, but he felt the shift when Isabella Bennet appeared. She moved into the dim light with the same unshakable presence she carried inside, though here, without the crowd, it seemed softer. She folded her arms loosely, her eyes drifting toward the skyline. "I needed to breathe," she said, her voice lower, more human than the commanding tone she had used in the ballroom. "It gets loud in there." Michael gave a short nod. "Yeah, it does." For a moment, silence stretched between them, but it wasn't strained. It was the kind of pause that belonged, as if the night itself was giving them space. Then Isabella's gaze turned, studying him not with curiosity, but with intent. "You're Emma's father," she said, almost as a statement rather than a question. Michael's lips curved into a quiet smile. "She's the best part of me." That made her smile too, not the polite kind she offered donors, but something warmer, touched with understanding. "I met her at the scholarship reception," Isabella said. "She gave a speech about wanting to be an astrophysicist. She said you taught her to love the stars." Michael chuckled softly, eyes shifting upward to the night sky above the city. "When she was little, I used to park the truck on clear nights, open the sunroof and point out constellations. Told her every star had a story." Isabella stepped closer to the railing, her emerald gown brushing against the cool stone. "And you gave her a story big enough to reach them." The words caught him off guard, not because they were grand, but because they carried weight. He looked at her, then really looked, and saw not the billionaire, not the figure who commanded rooms, but a woman who had lost parents young, who had built something out of grief and determination. She didn't speak of wealth or power. She spoke of children, of dreams, of burdens carried alone. And for the first time that evening, Michael felt seen, not as an outsider, but as an equal. They stood together, two different lives brushing against one another under the same sky. No titles, no expectations, just a father and a woman who understood what it meant to give everything for something bigger than yourself. The stars above didn't shine any brighter, yet Michael felt a shift inside, quiet but undeniable. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It was respect, the kind that grows roots before it ever grows leaves. When they finally turned back toward the ballroom, the noise seemed sharper, the eyes more pointed, but neither of them carried the moment like a secret. It wasn't about hiding. It was about knowing that connection could be forged in the simplest of places, on a balcony under a night sky, speaking of children and constellations, and that, in its own way, was enough to change everything. When Michael and Isabella stepped back into the ballroom, it was as if the air itself shifted. Conversations dipped, eyes turned, and a ripple of curiosity swept across the room. People had noticed their absence. People always noticed when Isabella Bennet disappeared, and they noticed even more when she returned with him. At first, it was a whisper at one table, a socialite leaning close to her companion with a sharp glance in Michael's direction. "Perhaps he's her next project," she murmured, the words carrying farther than she intended. Another guest added, "Maybe it's charity work, a scholarship father she wants to parade for sympathy." The tone was dressed in silk but carried the edge of disdain. By the time Michael reached his seat, the whispers had multiplied, twisting into stories of their own. "A tragic case," one man said with a faint smirk. "She always did have a soft spot for lost causes." At another table, someone laughed lightly, suggesting Isabella was entertaining herself by stepping outside the lines. The speculation grew, feeding itself, because the truth, that she had chosen to spend a few quiet moments with a man no one else saw, was something they could not easily make sense of. Michael felt the weight of it, though no words were spoken directly to him. The stares lingered longer now, sharper, searching for cracks they could name. Laughter that had once been distant now sounded closer, coated in curiosity, sharper at the edges. But he did not flinch. He lowered himself into his chair with the same calm he had carried all night, steady and deliberate, as though their whispers did not reach him. When a woman at his table leaned in, her tone sweet but her eyes calculating, she asked, "So, Mr. Carter, how exactly do you know Miss Bennet?" Michael met her gaze evenly, his voice calm and unembellished. "We talked about our kids." The simplicity of the answer left her blinking, caught off guard. It was not the story she had expected. No scandal, no performance, just authenticity. Around the room, the murmurs swelled, trying to restore order, to reframe what they had just seen. Because if Isabella Bennet could pause for someone like Michael Carter, a man in a borrowed suit with calloused hands, then perhaps their hierarchy wasn't as secure as they believed, and that thought unsettled them more than they cared to admit. Michael, however, remained untouched by the storm he had stirred. He kept his shoulders relaxed, his gaze soft, his silence purposeful. He didn't try to defend himself, didn't reach for explanations. He didn't need to. His calm presence became its own quiet rebuttal to every whisper. The more he refused to bend, the more the room seemed to tilt. Isabella, from her place at the front, carried on as though nothing had happened. Yet her choice to acknowledge him had already rewritten the unspoken rules of the evening, and everyone knew it. For Michael, the moment wasn't about triumph or validation. It was about holding his ground without anger, without apology, in a room built on appearances. He had nothing to prove, and that, more than anything, was what left them unsettled. The auction had always been the grand finale of the Bennett Foundation Gala, the moment when wealth became performance and status was measured not by presence, but by the size of a bid. Velvet catalogs rested on every table, pages filled with promises of exclusive getaways, priceless art, and dining experiences only the elite could afford. Hands lifted with ease, numbers climbing higher and higher, each paddle a declaration. "I can, therefore I will." Michael watched in silence. He had no paddle, no catalog. He was content to observe, his glass of water steady in his hand. To him, this wasn't a stage for competition. It was simply a reminder of how far his world stood from theirs. He thought of Emma's math homework waiting at home, of uniforms patched and repatched with careful stitches, and he smiled faintly. He didn't need any of what they were bidding on. His treasure sat under his own roof. Then came the final lot. The auctioneer's voice carried across the ballroom, dramatic and deliberate. "Our closing item this evening, a private dinner with Miss Isabella Bennet herself, an intimate evening at her estate, filled with conversation, fine wine, and the chance to plan future endeavors with the founder of this very foundation. A hum of excitement swept the room. Chairs shifted, whispers rose, and in an instant, paddles shot into the air. 10,000, then 20, climbing fast. The numbers leapt as easily as the laughter. 50,000 reached without hesitation. To the guests, it was not about dinner. It was about access, about standing closer to the gravity that Isabella carried. But before the auctioneer could call the next bid, Isabella herself rose from her seat. The room fell still. Even the air seemed to pause. She didn't raise a paddle. She didn't smile for effect. She simply stood, tall and certain, and spoke with a clarity that cut through every whisper. "I would like to make a change." The auctioneer blinked, caught off guard. The crowd shifted uneasily. Isabella's gaze moved unflinchingly toward Michael. "Tonight, I would like to place the winning bid, not for myself, but for someone else. $100,000, paid directly to the foundation, in the name of Michael Carter. If he agrees, I would like to share that dinner with him." The silence that followed was absolute. Forks stilled, glasses froze midair, the entire room suspended in disbelief. Michael sat motionless, stunned, her words ringing in his ears. He hadn't misheard. She had spoken his name clearly with purpose in front of everyone. Eyes turned to him, sharp, curious, some laced with disdain, others with bewilderment. But Isabella did not waver. She did not soften the moment with a smile or an explanation. She simply waited. Michael felt every gaze press against him, waiting for him to stumble, to shrink. Instead, he rose slowly, adjusting the borrowed jacket on his shoulders, his expression calm, his voice steady when it came. "If that's truly what you want," he said, meeting Isabella's eyes across the room, "then I'd be honored." A ripple spread through the ballroom. Gasps, murmurs, disbelief. Not because he had accepted, but because of how he had accepted, without apology, without theatrics. Just a man standing in his truth, no smaller than anyone else in the room. In that instant, the balance shifted. The same people who had dismissed him as a mistake now sat in silence, unable to deny what had just happened. Isabella had rewritten the rules, and Michael had met her choice with dignity. The gala, built on appearances, had been turned on its head. And for the first time that night, every eye in the room was not on the chandeliers or the stage or even Isabella, it was on him. The ballroom still hummed with stunned voices as guests began to file out, their whispers chasing one another like sparks in dry grass. Yet Michael walked with calm, each step measured, deliberate, the kind of walk that made people step aside without realizing why. Beside him, Isabella moved in silence, her presence as composed as ever, though her eyes carried a quiet weight. It wasn't until they reached the lobby, away from the chandeliers and the sharp scent of perfume, that she finally spoke. Her voice was lower now, stripped of performance. "I hope I didn't put you on the spot tonight," she said, hesitation threading through the words. "It wasn't my intention to make things harder for you." Michael turned toward her, the corners of his mouth lifting into a gentle smile. "You didn't," he answered softly. "You just gave me a place I never thought I'd be invited to." For the first time that evening, Isabella's poise shifted. She studied him closely, searching his face for any trace of bitterness or pride, but found only sincerity. It disarmed her in a way wealth and power never had. "You carry yourself like someone who doesn't ask for anything," she said quietly. Michael shrugged, not with regret, but with honesty. "Most of my life, I couldn't afford to. But that doesn't mean I've gone without. I've got Emma. That's worth more than anything in that room." They walked slowly toward the tall glass doors, the city lights beyond shimmering against the dark. Their conversation drifted easily to Emma, to the scholarship program, to the small things that carried the greatest weight. Michael told her about mornings spent driving his daughter across town so she could sit in classrooms that didn't remind her of what they lacked, about the nights he'd stitched holes in her uniforms, determined she would never feel different from her classmates. Isabella listened, not with polite nods or distracted glances, but fully, attentively, as though every word mattered. She shared pieces of her own story, of building something out of loss, of remembering what it meant to fight for dignity when the world tried to measure her by other scales. In the quiet space of the lobby, away from the spectacle, their words began to weave something rare, respect, understanding, not the kind built on titles or appearances, but on truth. Michael paused, his gaze softening as he looked at her. What happened tonight? It wasn't about money, it wasn't about a bid. You reminded me that dignity doesn't come with a price tag. It's not up for auction. It's something you carry, whether anyone sees it or not. Isabella's lips curved into a smile, gentle and unguarded. And tonight, you showed an entire room what that looks like. The doors opened and the cool Portland night swept in, carrying with it the sound of distant traffic and the faint scent of rain. For Michael, it felt like a cleansing breath. He had entered the Riverlight Hotel as a man who expected to be overlooked. He was leaving not with trophies or applause, but with something far greater. The certainty that his worth had never depended on their approval. And in that quiet certainty, he knew Emma would one day understand true dignity cannot be bought, sold, or measured. It simply is. And tonight, under the weight of 1,000 stares, it had stood tall. The morning after the gala began like any other. Michael rose before sunrise, the scent of coffee filling the small kitchen, the steady rhythm of the city, just waking outside his window. He sat at the worn table, the one with the uneven leg he'd braced years ago, and let the quiet settle around him. But something inside him felt different, lighter somehow, as though a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had finally eased. Emma rushed in, her hair still damp from her shower, backpack half-zipped and shoes untied. She froze when she saw him sitting there, his tie still draped loosely over the back of a chair. "Dad," she said, her eyes wide, "did you talk to her? Was it okay?" Michael smiled, the kind of smile that spoke more than words. "Better than okay," he answered softly. That was all he needed to say. Emma squealed, wrapped her arms around his shoulders, and in her embrace, he felt the truth of the night settle. Everything he had endured in that room had been worth it. Later that week, a letter arrived, heavy cream-colored paper, her handwriting elegant but unpretentious. Isabella thanked him for the conversation, for his honesty, for reminding her why she had started the foundation in the first place. She invited him to join the advisory board, not for appearances, but to give a voice to families like his. She ended with a single line that made him pause, reading it twice, then 3 times. "You changed more than just the evening. I'd like to see what else we might change together." Michael set the letter beside a photograph of Emma on her first day of school. For a long moment, he stared at both. The picture of his daughter, radiant with hope, and the words of a woman who had seen past the surface. And then he smiled quietly, because the future no longer felt like something he had to fight his way into. It felt like a door opening, gently waiting for him to step through. A few evenings later, Michael found himself at a small cafe tucked on the corner of a Portland street. It was nothing like the Riverlight Hotel. No chandeliers or marble floors, just the warm hum of conversation, the smell of fresh bread, the glow of string lights overhead. Isabella was already there, seated by the window, her emerald scarf draped casually over the back of her chair. She looked up as he entered, her smile unguarded, her eyes soft. "This feels more like me," Michael said, sliding into the seat across from her. "Me too," she admitted, her voice quiet, almost relieved. There was no pretense between them now, no audience, no stage, just 2 people, each carrying their own scars and strength, choosing to meet in the middle. They spoke of Emma, of the scholarship board, of ideas for the future. But woven between those words was something gentler, moments of laughter, the kind that came easily, and silences that were comfortable rather than strained. At one point, Isabella leaned slightly forward, her eyes meeting his with a quiet steadiness. "Do you think," she asked, her tone hesitant but sincere, "that we might continue this conversation, outside the noise?" Michael's answer was not rushed. He held her gaze, thought of Emma, thought of the night beneath the chandeliers, and then simply nodded. "I'd like that." And in that simple exchange, something new began. Not dramatic, not rushed, but real. A beginning born not from grandeur, but from respect, from shared burdens, and from the quiet healing that happens when 2 lives, once unseen, finally recognize one another. In the inspiring tale of Michael Carter, a humble single dad mechanic thrust into the glittering world of the Bennett Foundation Gala, we uncover a timeless life lesson. True dignity shines brightest not in wealth or status, but in the quiet strength of authenticity and unwavering love. Michael, clad in a borrowed suit and calloused hands from years of grease-stained toil, endured whispers and sidelong glances from the elite, who dismissed him as an outsider, unworthy of their polished circle. Yet, he stood firm, not for validation from strangers, but for his daughter Emma, whose scholarship dreams propelled him into that ballroom. His unyielding poise, rooted in memories of his father's lumber mill grit and night-stitching uniforms to shield Emma from hardship, reminded us that societal judgments are fleeting illusions, while inner worth endures like an unshakable anchor. Isabella Bennet, the billionaire heiress, saw beyond the facade, bidding on a dinner with him not out of pity, but recognition of his resilient spirit, forged in loss and sacrifice. This story tugs at the heartstrings, evoking tears for anyone who's felt invisible or undervalued, whispering that vulnerability and perseverance can bridge worlds, turning mockery into mutual respect and loneliness into profound connection. It's a raw reminder that life's greatest auctions aren't won with money, but with the courage to remain true amid adversity, inspiring us to honor our scars as badges of honor. Michael's journey from overlooked shadow to seen soul proves that dignity isn't bestowed. It's claimed, one steadfast step at a time, offering hope that second chances bloom when we least expect them. If this narrative stirred emotions in you, reflecting your own battles with judgment or triumphs of quiet resilience, share your heartfelt stories in the comments below. What moment in your life proved that authenticity conquers all? And don't forget to subscribe for more soul-stirring tales of human spirit, love, and transformation. Your engagement keeps this community thriving, one inspiring story at a time.